Alrighty folks, so there are just certain crops that I've figured out how to grow really, really well. And cucumbers, just like these babies right here, are one of those. And I've harvested all of these cucumbers here off of this small little section of cucumber plants that I have over the course of the last 5 or 6 days here. And when we look at the plant, there are even more, just like this one here, that are all set and ready to be harvested. So what I'm gonna walk you through in this video are my 9 biggest tips for growing cucumbers so that you can have an amazing crop. And the very first tip that I want to get started with is to start seeds indoors. And all that I do for this is I grab my 3-inch seed cells and I fill them all the way to the top with our worm casting seedling mix, and then I tap it a couple of times so there's about a 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter of space at the top, and I place 5 seeds into each of the seed cells. Then I give it 2 turkey bases of water, cover it with a little bit more seedling mix, and then 1 more turkey base of water. And if you're curious to see what I would do from there in terms of grow light and environment, temperature, how often I water, we've got a whole video that I walk through how to go about starting seeds indoors, and I'm going to leave the link to that down below in the description of this video. Now, over the course of the first 7 to 10 days, they're going to germinate and begin to grow, and while they do that, we move on to tip number 2, which is to prepare your soil. And so when it comes to cucumbers, they are big drinkers and big eaters. So we want to have a really nice and fertile soil that holds lots of moisture. And my personal preference on this front at the moment is to go with 75% compost and 25% vermiculite. Now, if you're gardening in a smaller environment, for the compost, you could go by the bag, and something like sea soil is a really great option. But if you're preparing a larger space, then you're going to want to go to a soil depot and pick up a 1/2 yard or a full yard or multiple yards of compost, and you want to look for their organic compost amender. That way it's just 100% compost that you're getting, where you then add the 25% vermiculite to it. And so once you've mixed up your soil, a little sub tip on this front is that cucumbers, they love sun. So wherever you're going to be either putting that raised bed, in-ground bed, or containers, make sure that you give your cucumbers a really nice sunny spot in your yard. When we look at mine, a lot of the garden gets hit with shade earlier on in the day, just based on the angle of the sun and how it hits my house. However, I know the back of my house has really good sun, and that's where I've put my cucumbers to grow this season. So now, with our cucumber babies growing indoors underneath the grow lights and the soil all prepped, the next thing is to begin moving them out into the garden. And so tip number 3 is to put them through a 7-day hardening off process. And this is the process of introducing your cucumber babies to the intensity and variability of the outdoor garden in a gradual manner. So on day 1, we're bringing them outside for 2 hours. On day 2, 4 hours, and continuing along until we get to day 6 or 7, and they're staying outdoors overnight. Now, a sub tip on this one is to not start this process until the average nighttime lows are at least 12 Celsius or 50 Fahrenheit. Again, they love the sun, they love heat. If we move them out earlier when it's still cooler than this, it's only going to really stunt their growth or ultimately do even worse to them. So being patient with them, moving them outside, is really, really beneficial. And if you want to see a full video on our 7-day hardening off process, which when I've utilized, I've never lost a seedling when I've been transplanting them into the garden, then I'm going to leave a link to that video down in the description of this video here. So go ahead and check that out for the full 7-day hardening off process. And so at the end of that, our babies are all set and ready to be transplanted into the garden. But before we do that, tip number 4 is to set up a trellis. And so what we can see behind me here is that we've got the cucumbers growing up this A-frame trellis, and this works incredibly well for them because they're able to grow vertically into new space and set out new runners or suckers in every direction, which ultimately results in way more flowers and way more fruit. And so if you want to have a similar A-frame DIY trellis in your garden, then I've put together a whole video on exactly how I've gone about building this out, and tons of folks have been utilizing it this season. So that link to that video is going to be in the description down below as well. And so now with our trellis in place, we are on to tip number 5, and that is to transplant with worm castings and superfood. And so on this front, all that we need to do is dig our transplant hole, and then we're going to sprinkle 1 handful of worm castings and 1 tablespoon of our 4-4-4 superfood, and then we're going to lightly massage that into the soil before we pop our baby into that transplant hole. Then we just backfill with the surrounding soil. And then I like to sprinkle one more handful of worm castings and 1 tablespoon of superfood around the main stem. And then I gently massage that into the soil before giving it a nice and big drink of water. The reason why we're doing this is because this is giving it all of the nutrients and all of the microbes that it needs to grow big and strong and put out tons of fruit for us. Again, cucumbers, really big eaters, really big drinkers. We want to make sure that they're all topped up with nutrition. So now tip number 6, this is a tough one, and that is to remove the initial flowers. So as your cucumber settles in and begins to grow, you're going to see some flowers establishing on the plant. And ultimately, as these get pollinated, this is where the cucumber will begin to grow. However, early on in the season, I encourage you to remove these. And the reason for this is because that redirects all of the plant's energy back into more foliage growth. By doing that, we get a larger canopy of leaves that allows the plant to photosynthesize more and ultimately results in even more cucumbers coming off of the plant. And so I know it can be a little bit challenging, but I really do encourage you to do that because you're gonna end up with way more cucumbers later on in the season. If you can't bring yourself to it, I won't hold it against you. I was in the same shoes earlier on, but now that I do remove those flowers, I do get way more cucumbers on my plants. So now we're gonna move into tip number 7. It is our third last one because we got 9 of them. We're nearly done. You nearly have all the education, all the information that you need to grow amazing cucumbers. And so stick with me here as we get through these last few. Tip number 7 is to not prune your plant. And so what you're going to notice on your plant is that the main stem is going to be growing out of the ground, and then it's going to put on some leafy or foliage growth, but then coming out of between the leaf and the main stem is going to be what's called a sucker or a runner. And ultimately this is going to grow, put out more foliage growth and as well as more flowers. And so my encouragement for you on this front is to leave all of those on your cucumber plant and allow it just to grow wild on that A-frame trellis that you have, because it's got so much space to crawl and do its thing. And that has worked incredibly well for me with increasing the number of cucumbers that I harvest off of the plant here. And so tip number 8, our second last one for today here, is to water heavily. So when we think about a cucumber, it is more than 90% water. And therefore, for the plant to be producing a lot of these at once, it needs to be getting tons and tons of water from its roots. And so for myself, I have an irrigation system. And what I do is I put one of the watering spikes right at the base of my cucumber plants. And during the peak of summer, like right now, I'm running that for 30 minutes per day. That ensures that the plant has all the water that it needs to not only be developing multiple fruit at once, but to be also putting out new foliage growth and new flowers. And so our 9th and final tip for today is to harvest early and to harvest often. And so our cucumbers are just like the rest of our plants in that they're going to taste best when they're on the younger side as fruits. So I encourage you to harvest them a little bit earlier, but on top of that, the plant is then able to redirect its energy from developing that fruit into putting out new foliage growth, new flowers, and ultimately developing more fruit. So it's going to allow you to get even more fruit off of your cucumber plant. And so what do you do with all of these cucumbers that are now coming off of the plants in your garden? Well, you can enjoy them fresh, but my personal favorite thing to do is to pickle them. And so what I've done is I've included a video to a quick pickle recipe that you can do in your refrigerator. You don't even need to can them or anything along those lines. And I've included that in the description of this video here. So I encourage you to check that out. But folks, if you follow those 9 tips that we just went through there, I guarantee that you're gonna have beautiful cucumbers coming out of your garden. If you do have any questions, just leave those down in the comments and I'll get a response to you super quickly. Other than that, I can't wait to catch you on the next video. Go get those hands dirty and I'll see you soon.